We'll talk a little bit about the integration. Ecotect can accept quite a few different file types. Mostly you'll probably be using like a DXF, maybe from SketchUp Pro or from an AutoCAD program, or a GBXML coming in from Revit or something else. Ecotect is actually not great for thermal calculations, but I'll sort of show you how to do them so you can at least get a baseline for how everything works. So there are these 5 different tabs on the left-hand side. In general, you'll want to start on this project tab just to give a sort of brief description of your project location, time zone, and here's where you would load the weather data file. So you can either use Google Maps and just click a point. You can just find a city or a time zone, or you can actually, if you have a specific site, like let's say it was something out in Waianae, or you didn't know the name of the city, or it was out of town or something like that, you could actually type in the latitude and longitude, which you can find from Google Maps or any number of places. Okay. By default, north is up. So once we actually have a model, we'll go through and just show how that you can tweak it. But if, let's say, your building was on a slight rotation from the cardinal points, instead of actually trying to model at a 17-degree angle, you can actually just flip this, and so it'll tweak the building even though it'll still line up for modeling. Okay. But for the most part, you won't really use this project tab once you've set up your initial location. You can also click up here on the globe to load a weather data file. And in the tutorial, it lists out, and I'll make sure it's on the file server, where you can find Hawaii data, also what other types, like .epw files, and some common websites where you can find those. Okay. So the next step, like most programs, is to set your preferences. And so you can decide if you want the black background or the white backgrounds. But then also there are standard color schemes. So for when you select an object, when there's an error, when, what shadows are going to be. So you can set all of that here, and then that'll help you with your images. Also, I guess if you're doing a presentation, you can crank this up a little. Also, you're going to want to set your units. Most of you are probably going to work in feet and inches, so you would set that here. A lot of these other things you can just keep as default. It's sort of only in specific situations that you might want to do this, or when you know a little bit more about the software. For the most part, I very rarely change these, but it doesn't hurt to just sort of review them, take a look, especially after you've used the program a couple times and you probably understand a little bit better what they mean. You can also set up your snaps here. The snaps will also be listed down on the bottom here. So the letters just line up, and for each one you can see there's an underlined letter, and so if you just type the M key, that'll turn on or off your midpoint snap. So as you're going through, once you become more familiar, and then you can set up that. And then the fixing links, again, I barely use. That's just sort of default is good. The nice thing though is you can apply this to all sessions. So once your default is set, you don't have to change it to feet and inches every time. This was developed by a professor down in Australia. So by default, a lot of things are going to be in millimeters and Celsius and all that, so you can tweak it. Okay. Basic navigation is actually the reverse of SketchUp. So if you're going back and forth, you're going to be kind of confused. But the right button allows you to orbit, and then the scroll wheel, when pressed down, allows you to pan. And then, of course, you can zoom in and out with it. Modeling is actually pretty straightforward. You don't model by components. Everything's done with planar surfaces. So even a wall that's 6 inches thick is only a plane in the model, and then it has material properties, which we'll get to, where you can assign what it is, how thick it is, what its R and U values are. So for modeling, Usually you'll start with a zone, because all of the analysis is going to be done by zone. There's also a document up in the same Ecotect folder which will explain proper ways to zone your building. When you bring in the GBXML model, oftentimes it'll zone it by spaces or rooms, so every room will be a different zone. But oftentimes when you want to do your analysis, you're zoning out by the south side of the building or the east and west face or the second floor. And so in those cases you'll have to change the zones around. The zone can be thought of as sort of a closed box, because in order to do the analysis, it has the Ecotect model has to think of these different enclosed spaces. So if you just use partitions and create a square, it won't think of that as a room or a volumetric space. So click on the zone, click on a point. You can also set the default height in that preferences section, but then we can tweak it once it's set up. Okay. Click on your different points. You can see even when I'm modeling it, it always considers it an enclosed space. So once you get that third point, then you can just hit escape. But the F5, 6, 7, and 8 keys are your orientation. So if you click F5, maybe I need to do this first. Okay. There we go. So if you click F5, it'll show your plan views. F6 and F7 are your elevations, which really are not very different when you only have the box. And then F8 will get you back to perspective view. Okay. What's that? You can't, actually. There's just one modeling space. There we go. So if you have a situation like we did where you modeled it slightly off, if you double click on a space, it'll bring up that object with the nodes. Okay. If it brought up the wrong space or wrong plane for some reason, the space bar will actually flip between. If you select one line, it'll actually flip between whatever the surfaces are that you've selected. But if you double click, then you can actually click on a node, shift click to select multiple, pop back over to plan view, and then the X, Y, and Z keys, like bump, they can actually shift the nodes that are selected. So depending on what plane you're looking at, so it looks like if we want to move it to the right, that would be positive X. So if you just click the X, it didn't seem to like that. Let's go back to perspective view. Okay, well, it doesn't seem to want to do it on this machine, but trust that it works. So the X, Y, and Z keys, and then if you hold down the Shift and X, it'll move the node in the negative direction on that axis. So you can just bump it over. You can also just select it and move it if you wanted to. Okay. So we'll go ahead and just create.
Move the ceiling to the Z direction, right? The ceiling?
Yeah.
You kind of move it in the Z direction.
You actually can bump it in the. Oh, you know what? It looks like it. That's interesting. I might have clicked it twice when modeling. Okay. But you can create multiple zones. If there's a space or a void in between the zones, then you cut a hole. So don't try to model the space in between it. They should in general all be connected. Okay. So if ever you want to see what it looks like, you can go down to the Visualize tab, and that will show you a rendered view. Yeah, I think I must have set up to click twice over here. So that's your rendered view. And then if you wanted to put a door in between those spaces, click space, you can click the Insert key or click on this window icon, which will give you the option. You can also set up your toolbars however you'd like. So windows, voids, openings, or doors. Select it and model it. It's actually, if you select the Insert key, which I'll do in a second, it'll give you a window to actually click those. Okay. And so in order to see that door, we'll have to cut a hole. So let's put a window in there. Clicking the Insert key brings up this window that will allow you to actually specify the dimensions. By default, it's going to plug it in the center of whatever plane you selected, but you can actually specify if you want that offset or what height you want it to be. Okay. So now, if we go to our rendered view, we have a hole, and we can see it made a door. Okay. If the zones are adjacent, then cutting the door in one will also cut it in the other. So you don't have to match up voids or holes. It knows enough to do that. And there's something when you do some of your calculations where it'll ask you if you want to calculate interzonal adjacencies, and you just always say yes. So if you wanted a nice flat roof structure, then you can just stay with this and you're all set. But there's also the ability to model a roof, and they have a separate parametric object for that. Okay. So over on the right-hand side here, we'll get into these in a second. On these different tabs, you can specify some more specific, detailed information. There's no like properties navigation toolbars or anything like that that'll pop up. So it's all done from this right-hand tab side. So if you needed to adjust the depths of your eaves or gutter or the height, you can do all that here. You don't have to necessarily just do standard pitched roof. That's the default. But to pretty much do all non-orthogonal shapes, you can do that from this Parametric Objects tab, which is this one down here. Okay. If this is just an attic, then you're okay, or you might just model a small void here. If it's an example of like a church or something where that actually opens up straight, that room opens up all the way to the roof, then you would have to cut out a void that was the size of the entire top plane. You wouldn't just model partitions around, put a floor and then put a roof on top of it. You have to think of it in zones. One of the descriptions in the help section actually tells you to think of it as if you were filling your building up with water. You would want it to obviously can be completely sealed in order to do these calculations. Okay. You can then do it again on this side if you think that first roof looks kind of weird. Oh. And then, see, this is one of the areas where the bumping the nodes is nice, because then you can start switching things over, you would know on that one side. There, it's sort of working now. So you switch to different views, you can do the bumping. So you get the idea. Okay. You'd have to actually go back and fix this because it looks like it selected the ridge to be a little bit higher on that other one. But the basics, there you have your quickly modeled house. Okay.
Would you create a void in the other roof?
Yeah.
So make it like one roof.
Yep. Yep. You'd have to do the same thing to actually combine them. Otherwise, because right now this is just a roof that's adjacent to a roof. So if in your actual building you wanted it to be one open area, then you would have to void. Yeah. Anytime you're combining two things that are zoned separately but need to be thought of as one object, then you need to separate them with a void. Okay. And it generally recognizes that pretty well. Okay. So you can also, there are other objects here. You can create partitions, you can create planar surfaces. So if we had a shading device, plug that in there. I always forget to hit escape on that last one. All right, or if you had a room partition on the interior, you can plug that in. All right, so then you have your nicely modeled building. If for whatever reason you ever needed to bump things, or you needed to do some modeling and you wanted to shift, you can insert nodes. Oops, that didn't go where I wanted it to. Okay. Come on. Well, let me just show you here. Oh, I think I'm on the wrong zone. So you can actually add a node, let's say, to the shading device if you wanted this to be like a pentagon shape. And then you could just bump that out to play with it. Okay. So the modeling is pretty straightforward. If you have a really simple shape or you just want to do a massing model, oftentimes it's easier to just do it in Ecotect. If you have a massing model in SketchUp, let's say, you need SketchUp Pro, which the lab does, or at least did have. The license may have expired. But if you have SketchUp Pro, then you can export your SketchUp model in a DXF format and then import it into Ecotect as well. If you're bringing in Revit models, that's bringing in all the properties of that model as well. And so depending on what kind of analysis you're doing, you have to sort of figure out what the best or easiest way to do it is. Because if you bring in a Revit model, it's going to be very detailed. It's going to be very hard to edit once it's in Ecotect. So you have to be pretty comfortable with what's being brought in. Okay. And if you're just doing a simple like shading or daylight study, then you probably don't need all of the components and material properties that are going along with it. Okay, so I just rambled for a little while. How are we doing? Any questions on the modeling component? Yeah.
For modeling, can you temporarily hide components
Yes.
if you want to add more partitions?
Yeah, and that's especially useful if you're bringing in a Revit model because it's going to be impossible to read when you have all these skeleton wires overlapping on another. You also can't edit anything from the Visualize tab. This is really just displaying a rendered view. So you have to do it from this. You do have different options. So you can, sort of like SketchUp, you can change it a little bit, but for the most part, this is what you're working with. So the easiest way is to just turn off certain zones. The zones are not really equivalent to layers, but they're treated in the same way. So you wouldn't really have a different layer for windows or doors because those are child objects of a zone. But all the zones in terms of freezing and turning them on and off and how you would edit them and assign things, that's similar to layers. So each one of those rooms that I created is a different zone. And so if you wanted to turn it off, you would just hide it. Well, this freezes it. And then the T is for thermal. So you can have a zone, but if you don't want to include it in the thermal calculations, let's say it's a, I don't know, courtyard or an exterior space or something, or if you just want to look at one particular room and don't want to have 70 different lines of analysis, you can turn those off for thermal. You can also lock it if you don't want to accidentally add nodes or click things. So by doing that, that hides that zone, and then you can keep working.
And for a record model, when you bring it into Ecotect, you have to save it as instead of GBX.
Yeah, it's .gbxml. Yep. We'll go over the import process in a second as well. But it's a standard export format out of Revit. And that GBXML format is really sort of green building export format. So whether you're working with Design Builder or Ecotect, or you're almost always going to be exporting in that format if you're trying to do some sort of environmental analysis. Okay. So that's a pretty good segue. We'll look through these tabs now. So this first is just the selector. It's just, honestly, you don't really use it. It's just some design properties, most of which you can edit when relevant in other places. The second tab is your zone management. If you right click on a particular zone, it gives all the objects and all the the options for that zone. So if, let's say, for example, you knew that this room was zone 2 and you wanted to add this shading device to zone 2, you could just select the object, right click on it, and move object to. And then that changes it. So then when you, let's say, froze it or highlighted it or did a thermal analysis, it would be included. As an aside, when you're bringing in spaces or rooms from Revit, each room, each volumetric space is going to be created as a zone, and then the windows and doors and all of that are going to be actually child objects of that. Any shading device or partition that's not within this bounded room is going to be brought over and considered a shading device just by default. So it won't actually be in a zone. You'll have to, I mean, you don't necessarily have to attach it, but if you wanted it to be linked, then you would have to do that.
So does the zone numbering go by the room numbering in Revit? So will it translate?
It does, actually. Yeah. So it'll just have a list of 200 zones here. I can actually, maybe towards the end, I can show that because I have a Revit model on my machine. But so it does do that. So you will be able to see, and you can highlight it by selecting the zone to find it in the model. But looking at most buildings on campus, if you're looking at 200 rooms, it's kind of hard to see. You're probably going to want to isolate. So it does help that you can recognize that. Okay. Just in general, when you start playing around with Ecotect, it's a fairly intuitive software. We're not going to go through every option, but if you just mouse over all the different buttons and keys, you'll see, if you wanted to create a new zone or edit properties or sort of whatever you need to do, that can all be done from here. If you wanted to isolate the zone, like sort of what Paula was saying, if you think of zones as layers in terms of what you're able to do with them, then I think you'll sort of fundamentally understand it. The next tab is the Materials tab. How are we doing on time? Actually, kind of short. Okay. So the Materials tab is just that. It'll tell you for a given object what it is. It'll default to certain things. If it assumes it's a vertical surface, then it assumes a wall. So if it's a horizontal surface on the bottom of a zone, it assumes a ground slab. But you can edit properties for any of these. So if this was the second floor and let's say it wasn't a concrete slab, you can change it. So these are the default options. you can select one, or if you're not sure what that means, like concrete floor, carpeted, suspended. If you double click on that option, it brings up this whole properties tab for that particular material. So then you can actually see what the embedded information is, or you can just change it. Because really, because you're not doing any sort of fancy renderings from here, for the most part, you may a little bit out of radiance, but for the most part, the object is just the sum of its properties. So if you needed to change the U value, or if you knew what your particular, let's say, wall makeup was, or what the R value was, you could just type it in. But you can also play with the layers. So it does get pretty detailed in terms of what you can do. So right now, it shows you all the different pieces that are involved. So even though this is a planar surface in the model, it has all these different parts to it. They have thicknesses, they have densities, they have conductance rates. So you can actually use that for when you're doing your thermal model. You want to make sure that all of that links up. Any questions on that? It's kind of straightforward. You can just, it's sort of drag and drop, and then you can move things around and it'll adjust it and tweak it, and then you can set the thicknesses and it'll actually adjust in this little display screen here. So it's kind of nice to be able to use. And then it shows all the different options on the side here of what you can select, what you can do with it. And then you can actually create new and add to your global library. So if you have a standard wall that you use in Revit, you can add it to your Ecotect library and then just easily assign it to the zones. You have a question?
If we already created material settings in Revit, do we still need to do that? Or does the information transfer?
It should transfer.
So it automatically knows that's going to happen.
Yeah. It'll actually, when you're importing, I guess I'll talk about this now. So when you're importing, it'll specify what it thinks something is as you're bringing it in, and then you can sort of reassign it in the import screen.
But there is a very important thing is all this information is not used for Ecotect simulation. The information for every layer, actually the Energy Plus just give the total R value for the simulation. But this one is you use for, it's just used for when you export to the Energy Plus file. But then for Ecotect, they just use the, just the total number R value on it. So it's, if you don't want the unique for Ecotect, you don't have to do this one.
Yeah, this is fairly robust in being able to set this up, but like Tuan was saying, it's sort of for your own benefit. If from the initial property screen you just know what the U value is of your whole wall section, just type that in and it'll calculate it the same as if you had actually modeled it correctly on the second tab there. Okay. It's kind of more for your benefit. So, but that holds true for doors, windows, everything else as well. So you can set this is a single glazed timber frame window, or you can have a skylight, or whatever the case may be. You would just set that up here. Okay. And so those would just have embedded properties that you can change as needed. If at any point your model is off the grid or it's weird, you can always hit Control F to bring the grid back to whatever your model size is. So if you import something, if you hit Control F, it'll do that. Sometimes when you import something, you had another random piece over here, so that'll show you that you had that because it would have it huge and highlight pretty much everything in your model. So then you could delete it, hit Control F again, and it'll zoom you to your nice screen. And it shows that here. This, for whatever reason, if you're using this to model and you have particular increments, like, I don't know, 8-foot rooms or something, you can set up your grid so it'll snap a little easier. But you probably won't use this too much. It's really just sort of how you want things to look and whether the north arrow displays, things like that. Okay. You can switch the foreground and background colors from here as well. Relative sketchiness is never used, to be honest. But one of the likely tabs that you, options you'll use from this tab is the ability to cut a section. So from this eyeball tab here, the visualization settings, you can make it transparent to be able to see. This gets to be quite useful. You can also cut away a section. So then you can see pretty clearly that your void's not working, or that you need to really fix this roof area here because it didn't actually work as planned when you tried to combine them. Okay. From this choose sectional axis is where you decide whether it's a plan view or elevation section or what have you. Okay. And then just by moving the slider determines the height, which is of course more useful when you're doing this sort of section. So let's actually switch it to the other side here.
Can you cut away 2 times?
You cannot. No, it's just you pick an axis and then you pick a length. But let's say, for example, we wanted to see the effects of sunlight through this window here. So you cut your section. Oops, I actually didn't. There we go. Okay. Then this next tab down is your shadow settings. So display shadows. Display your daily sun path. And you can also display the annual if you want. So if you click your F5 view with the annual, this should look pretty familiar to most of you guys. Okay, so you can actually create your sun path and do all that. This is also defaulting to an Australia location. So this is where we could just go in here and flip the orientation of our building 180 degrees. And now that's a little more relevant to our window. Okay, got rid of my section. Alright, so you got your shadows turned on, you got your sun path turned on. There are a bunch of other options as well that I'm not going to go through, but they're pretty self-explanatory, like view from sun position, for example. Okay. And then if you click down here, you can see you can also drag the sun to see at a particular time of day, or you can even type in the date and time up here. And there are some quick jump to points if you wanted to see the winter solstice, to find your low sun angles or your high sun angles. You can get to those pretty quickly. Okay. In order for something to be a reflected surface, you have to tag it as a reflected surface. And if you don't want the entire model, so we're in a pretty basic model right now, but if you're bringing in one of the Revit models, it's going to be a lot more complex. So instead of just turning on shadows and going crazy, you're probably going to want to make it more specific to what you're looking at, what you want to be a shaded object. So if we just clicked on this floor surface, tag object as shaded, it's just going to show it for that surface. And so you could do that for a floor, you could do it for the far wall, you can see if any light's ever going to get through this door. But then it's a lot easier to manage when you're looking at it, especially from this view. Okay.
I have a question. Can you do that on the site itself? So if you have like a high rise, for example, you don't necessarily want this rooms to be shaded, but you want to show it its effect on the site?
Yep.
Would you have to make a zone in itself?
You wouldn't have to make a zone, you would just set up a plane.
Okay.
So you could just set up your lots. If you have, different TMK lots and you want to see how it's going to affect the lot next door, something like that. You could do that. Create that plane. And then if you just wanted to tag this as your shaded object, yeah, it probably wouldn't even be touched. But then you can see how that might affect and whether it's ever gonna touch it. So if you do your daily. Okay, so just at the very end of the day, and there's actually a way to calculate shading as well. So you can find that it was only 10% shaded for one portion of the day. But yeah. So there's no way to create like trees or other shading devices in Ecotect, so you would just have to create like planar surfaces or obstructions, or if you wanted to model the building next to it, you would just create a 100-foot zone or whatever it is next to it and then see what kind of effect that shading had on that structure.
So if you're importing people from Rabbit and they actually doing
It doesn't. Yeah. Either that or sometimes it'll bring it in as just like a T. So just two planar surfaces. 'Cause even like if you think of what the people and objects look like in SketchUp, it just sort of rotates the view, but it's not actually a three-dimensional person. So it's not the best way to model trees and the effects that those might have. Some of that, especially if you're presenting this for a project, is going to be more theoretical. You might have some sketches to go with it. But it will help if you're doing like a CFD analysis to actually just put some obstruction there to funnel the air under it.
Is there a way to save those and then reuse them again in another project?
Save what?
Those obstructions that we make.
Oh,
so let's say
yeah.
you're making
So
like a fake tree and then you want to reuse it in another Ecotech project. Does it save content or have a?
no, so you couldn't like create a like tree component or something like that. It's actually pretty basic for modeling. You can load one model into another model. So if you had a site that you wanted to keep reusing with different models, you could try doing that. Or you could just, if you had a particular tree that you spent a really long time modeling, then you could, you could bring that in.
Can you bring just components? Like in a 3ds Max, you just bring one thing from another model.
So it doesn't sort of think of them as components. You would just have to export that as a separate object and import it into the existing model. Yeah. So you'd have to have whatever it is you wanted to bring in as its own file, and then just bring that in and make sure it was properly scaled.
So I guess you could start saving those files then, as in a library.
Yeah,
as
you'd have to
your
sort of
kind
create your own,
component, yeah.
and then it wouldn't think of it as that, but you could still sort of do that. Yeah. Okay, so if we want to see how effective this shading device is, I think you can probably already assume not very. You can sort of play with that. See? And then, like I was saying, with the nodes, you can click on it and expand it, or if you wanted to move it farther from the window, you could see what effect that would have on that surface. If you cut your section from a plan view and just watched it that way, excuse me, you could do that. Let's see, you can also from the calculate, if you select your window, you can actually just call up an instant sun path diagram. And then you can, this is what I was saying with the calculate shading, it can tell you the percentage. I'm not sure if it'll work for this, but let's try. Yeah, so that doesn't actually, so we're looking at it through the window, but if you selected your surface, you can find out percentages. But again, this should probably look familiar to most people. This is kind of an ugly one, but and for Steve's class, we didn't really learn the different types. Stereographic is sort of standard, but if you ever were interested, there are like 8 different ways of calculating that. Okay. But anyway, so you can see that because this window is on the east side, you don't need to worry about it. Well, again, we're in Australia, so everything's reversed right now. But obviously, there'd be no sun coming in as soon as it gets overhead and passes that window. But then you can calculate at certain times of year and what the actual shading is going to be like, whether it's going to be shaded or whether sunlight's coming in. And then you can tweak it. There is a shading design wizard, so you can actually let the program create your shading device, but it's not very good. Or it'll create some monstrous polygon obstruction that you would never ever put in a building. But if you ever wanted to get 100% shading, you can just have it create that for you. The other thing you can do is tag an object as a reflected surface. So if you wanted to see what the sun was doing. Okay. So you can show solar rays. Let's change the spacing to 1 foot. So as an aside, if you're bringing in a detailed Revit model, make sure your spacing is kind of large to start with and then shrink it. Because you have solar ray every 3 inches on a 100-foot model, it's going to take half the day to just try to render that one view. So just start it out high and then go lower. And then you also want to show at least a couple bounces just to see what's going on. So it's only showing it for the one object that I tagged as a reflected surface. So in general, that might not be too handy to tag the shading device. You may want to just tag the floor inside and see when sunlight's getting through and where it's bouncing to, or what kind of glare you're going to get, depending on the angle of your shading surface. So that's a way to do that. Okay, we're at 11, so we're going to go a little quicker. So you can also set up an analysis grid for if you want to actually do some calculations. So you can display the analysis grid. Usually what you're going to want to do is just auto-fit grid to object. Okay. So you can show a 3D grid, but it's probably easiest at least to start out with a 2D grid. Put your offset, whether you want it at, let's say, table height or floor height or eye level. Set that up, set your grid management, depending on how fine grain you want it, if you want a 10 by 10 grid or a 100 by 100 grid. Okay. And then once you've set up your grid, then you can actually run some calculations. So that'll work both for lighting and thermal. So if you click, it'll run you through a wizard. The wizard is pretty self-explanatory, actually. So right now we're just looking at natural light levels over the entire analysis grid. We're going to do a very low precision. Again, it depends on whether you're doing this for your own knowledge or for like a rendered image for your board. But if you tried to do a very high view on an entire floor plate, obviously it's going to take you a while. The design sky luminance, Steve talks about this somewhat. So you can actually just calculate it from the model latitude, what that's going to be. It's closer to like 1,000 or 1,100 foot candles in Hawaii. Okay. You can even specify window cleanliness, and then it basically just acts as sort of a filter. Okay, shows that, and then it just runs through your calc. And then, let's see how much you were paying attention in Steve's class. What's a good daylight factor percentage? What's that? Yeah. So like 4 or 5% is actually, you'd be able to see and read, you'd be okay. So with this one window with shading on the east side, for the most part, your room is going to be fairly dark, not surprisingly. But right under the window, the average daylight factor is going to be pretty good. You're going to be able to read just fine. So there you go.